Hi all, so today we go back to the lower Middle Ages and talk about 14th and 15th century Italy, and we will try to answer to the question of why Italian city-states were so wealthy at the time. Where did their wealth come from? And it's not really a video about the causes why Italy was, the economical power at the time during Middle Ages. There are many great premises. You have to think that Italy remained essentially the wealthiest country per capita ininterruptedly from the Roman times um, until the late 17th century. So there are many historical reasons and implications that we can just hint about, but we will, try to look at Italian city-states in their, especially in their geographical location relatively to the trade routes of medieval Europe, and try to answer to the question. So obviously Italy wasn't the only very wealthy and developed area of Europe. We can see that in the low Middle Ages, the whole European continent was fastly on the rise, fastly at least compared to what had been in the previous centuries of the early and high Middle Ages, and it was quite evident that there were certain areas into which the distribution of wealth was concentrated. And we're talking about, in fact, Italy, and more specifically central and northern Italy, so not really Italy conceived as the whole modern country, and together with it, the Flanders, who had already been after Italy one of and shared many similarities with the Italian urban centers. We're talking about a wealth that really gravitated around the urban centers in Europe. Not much because of the urban centers proper, or at least not only because of that, but mostly and especially because the presence of the urban center was the same proof of a particular strategical importance of that center from an economical point of view that had allowed that development. So you can find other areas, most famously the one of the Hanseatic Dominion in northern Germany, between the North and the Baltic Seas. Even though that was quite different, because the Hanseatic cities were extremely wealthy, but their greater strength was actually derived from their union. Hanseatic cities were never as rich as the Italian ones individually. And this obviously has to do with the peculiar situation that you can find in Germany that differs from the Flanders and from northern central Italy, etc. So we will focus strictly on the Italian peninsula at this point and try to explain where did all that wealth came from in this area. We can say, obviously, that there were very many important premises, as I was recalling before, chiefly the fact that Italy was a very fertile, densely populated region of Europe, and the most developed in many ways. Fertility really meant a lot in in a world that was dominated by a largely agricultural economy. We have to think also about the Roman infrastructures that all over Europe favored the rebirth of trade during the Middle Ages, and obviously Italy had retained more of that, not just because Italy had been the center of the Roman Empire, but because the cities had, for other reasons, during the Middle Ages had never really died out like it had happened in other regions of Roman Europe, like Britain or, or northern France, etc. In Italy, you find a urban continuity throughout all the Middle Ages, in obviously with certain transformations. It wasn't really something, direct, but it's pretty much obvious that most of the most important Italian centers in the low and late Middle Ages were actually and had been Roman cities of some importance, and some of them, as we will be seeing, were already quite important centers at the time. There are exceptions, though. Think about Venice, for instance, that didn't exist in Roman times. And we can, however, identify probably the most important reason why Italy was so wealthy. In terms of its geographical location, and pointing out that this location, so in the mid of the Mediterranean, and therefore between I mean in a sea that united west and east, obviously immensely favored Italy as a trade nation, let's say, because this is really important to mention. Italy wasn't and still is not a huge producer of materials like metals or stuff like that. It's not extremely wealthy land, aside from the fertility of its soil. However, its position has always, since the ancient age up to today, obviously favored through the building of facilities and therefore investments into infrastructures, trade in all its forms, and especially sea trade. So what the Italians actually did during the Middle Ages, we can't say especially from the 11th century, but it's something that starts increasing sensibly even before, since the end of the 8th century, is that the Italians began to become the medium between East and West, commercially speaking, which means that they invested a lot of resources into shipbuilding, and they began to literally move the goods from Europe to Asia and Africa, and therefore connecting these continents and allowing the shifting of goods. And in the process, Italy obviously didn't even consume probably the majority of these resources, but on the contrary became extremely wealthy financially speaking, because they were sort of obligated passage between Europe and any other on the other continents. So you can argue that everything really started from that. The Italian maritime republics and the centers of mainland Italy began to accumulate a huge wealth throughout all the low Middle Ages, and through that they were able to essentially buy anything they could, and to have I don't know how to say it in English, but it's like a purchase power that was unprecedented even during the ancient world. In this process is extremely important for many reasons, because, and we will be talking about that, I think, for many times in future videos, because it's basically the reason why Italy was the cradle of the Renaissance and modern European culture. And it all began from these financial good. Obviously, this triggered in turn all those dynamics that favored a great development. Italians were on average the most schooled Europeans at the time. They even in the countryside, peasants, or at least a good a substantial part of them was literate. This happened, by the way, also because Italy never had such the Italian countryside has been always tied and very close to the cities. It's not like in other regions of Europe, like in France or Germany, where there is the world of the forest, that is in which there are communities who dwell essentially detached from the cities and the international trade. The whole Italian population was somehow committed and engaged into this process. Italy has also very high density of population, so these favored also certain forms of organizations that were quite complex, and that could be built up through these fuel coming from investments on sea trade, etc. So all the history of Italy that is of infinite importance in the during the Middle Ages, and in this sense, the Italians also played a role that was quite ambiguous in many ways, because there was this prejudice, especially from Central Europe. There was a largely feudal and agrarian and rural world that saw these Italian merchants as a sort of ambiguous figures that only thought about money. There's all a literature about this, which is very caricatural indeed. Also, the Italians didn't have such very pleasing stereotypes regarding other peoples. The Middle Ages were a quite bizarre era. People normally believed that their neighbors were kind of demi-animals, or stuff like that. There was a lot of ignorance indeed. But what's behind this is that basically the Italians had reached the monopolium over the trade between West and East, and this was a monopolium that obviously was quite remunerative, and we can't say that no one actually managed to take them away, to take it away from them. Maybe just the Aragonese, but until the Atlantic routes were not opened, which is something that the Italians actually did, especially the Genoese, but that eventually passed to Spain, France, England, etc. The Mediterranean was essentially an Italian lake. There were Italians everywhere, but this is not something really that stopped to the Middle Ages. Up to the last century and up to today in certain measures as well. You understand that Italian was sort of even as a language was something very widespread. Mediterranean ports understand Italian slang quite easily, because indeed the Italians always managed to infiltrate everywhere, anywhere there was a profit to obtain. And think even about the course of Mediterranean history, from the Fourth Crusade and fall of Constantinople, or the role that the Italian navies had during the clash against the Ottomans, or or during the Crusades, most notably. The Italian maritime republics really made a lot to make history take a certain path, and the Mediterranean was the theater of this enterprise. Um, and it is very important because it was something that deeply affected even continental European history, because all the goods that Italians imported from the east eventually flowed into to the European continent. So even the request for certain goods, etc., was depending on the contact with the Italians, so that the French, the Germans, the English had, very intense, very strong relations with Italian city-states, even for banking reasons, because the Italians literally financed all the major wars that had been fought in low medieval Europe. This is something that they kept doing even during the modern age. Think about the Genoese with the Spanish Empire. The Italian investments really reached very far, and you can understand that even for banal mercantile infiltration. You find Italian merchants literally everywhere in Europe during the Middle Ages, and especially the low and late Middle Ages. And you have to imagine every region of Europe, the coasts of Mediterranean Africa and Near East, constantly populated by groups of Italian merchants that operated quite often in full coordination with the governments of their respective city-states, quite often, even more often in competition with each other, because the Italians fought against each other for the whole Middle Ages in this sense, and all this wealth actually explains the same Italian political fragmentation, because one thing is to conquer a land that substantially is pretty much homogeneous in terms of income, that doesn't have centers that prevail. But if you look at the political map of medieval Italy, you find that all these city-states merged because they were so wealthy that they could pursue their own expansionistic policies in a completely autonomous way, and any project of creating a centralized monarchy in Italy eventually failed. And the reason why the only monarchy was created essentially in southern Italy was due to the fact that the Normans had imported feudalism in there, and they had managed to choke at a very early stage of the development of the of low medieval Italian cities in the south of the peninsula. In fact, the local political autonomies. So eventually the Angevins and the Aragonese, even though having trouble with centralization differently from the Normans, especially against the barons, did maintain this substantially unitary kingdom that was a unique thing. But central and northern Italy, in spite of the rise of regional states and lordships that could substantially arrange a more compact and more rational territorial and political organization, never managed to surpass the base that was practically the single city that had and maintained, at least potentially, always a great autonomistical ambition. And obviously, the most famous cities in Italy for wealth and especially trade are renownedly Genoa and Venice, that were the major Italian maritime republics. Telling the truth, two very different systems, at least. If one takes certain standards, that they have very different stories, but they substantially pursued common interests. They waged war against each other very much. Genoa at the point was even managing to wipe Venice out, which is strange because normally Venice was the stronger, and eventually she won. But in fact, the Genoese from the defeat against the Venetians eventually shifted their interests towards the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic Sea. Or better, the Atlantic coast, because the Genoese, at least at that time, nobody ventured into the ocean yet. And this is not really just because Genoa is in the west and of Italy and Venice in the east. It's more because effectively, the Genoese couldn't hold the competition with Venice up to a certain point in the eastern Mediterranean, which was incidentally the wealthiest place, in the sense that it was in fact the area that connected Europe to Asia in the east, and China, etc., and India, etc. However, we can't say that Genoa managed to flourish anyway, and to establish the Atlantic route, especially with England, passing the Gibraltar Straits and finding good logistical bases in Spain, etc. While Venice, from her lagoons, managed to play a bit rougher, in the sense that they managed to take the Genoese out. By the way, thanks to the aid of the Aragonese maritime power, that shouldn't be forgotten. At a point, they were all rivals at that point, but Venice had chosen, temporarily to back Aragon against Genoa. Then, obviously, also the Aragonese at a point became rivals of Venice, especially when they conquered southern Italy and they could block from the Strait of Otranto with between Apulia and the Balkans, through which the Venetian ships passed from the Adriatic to the Ionian seas. And obviously Venice maintained larger territories into the east. She managed to keep certain lands of the Balkan coast that basically remained Venetian until today, we can say, because many areas of coastal areas of the Western Balkans speak Venetian still. They kept many Greek islands, Crete most notably, certain areas even of Greece, of the Greece mainland, from Epirus to Morea, and also they managed to keep at a point Cyprus and etc., and many other dominions that eventually they had to defend from the Ottoman Turks during their advance towards through the Balkans towards Western Europe. But at the same time, Venice had also land interests, at least from a certain point onwards, and these interests were still commercial in many ways, because Venice was extremely important for the Germanic world, and Venice had very strong ties with Germany, especially with Bavaria. In the south, because obviously it's just across the Alps, and the Venetians managed to develop terrestrial trade with Central Europe and to take advantage of this. Germany and Italy at the end of the Middle Ages and the early modern era were some of the most were definitely most advanced countries in the world, and this was also due to their contact, into which the Venetian expansion to the Italian mainland played a very important role. there are many things we could talk about. There were obviously also other relations that Genoa and Venice had with the mainland. For instance, with northern Italy, as we just saw with Venice, that began to expand to towards Lombardy to counter the Milanese power. But Genoa also, for instance, with Pisa, that had been a very fierce adversary of hers, but which became essentially a trading partner at a point. Pisa had a very important role, especially for the trade with central Italy. Pisa being in Tuscany. It was one of the few maritime republics that basically pursued both a maritime and terrestrial policy of expansion. Pisa had various territories into the Tuscan mainland. She fought against Florence. She intervened in many land battles with troops, mercenaries, and crossbowmen, etc. And the relation with Genoa had been important because Pisa actually sees her maritime decline after the Battle of the Meloria in 1284 against Genoa, after which she basically lost Corsica. She saw her ambitions drastically resized in the Western Mediterranean, and that's the point at which Genoa is fully on the ascent, and Venice starts being overly concerned, rightfully concerned, telling the truth. But Pisa at that point, her ambitions were already mentioned, but she at that point she affiliated to Genoa, so backing her, but on her track, keeping to earn from the sea trade, which was a quite brilliant move. And in fact, Pisa remains a city of discrete power in the Italian affairs up to a certain point, at least in the 14th century. The main importance of Pisa in this sense was the role that she had as a connection between the Tyrrhenian Sea and let's say the whole Tuscany, more or less, and even beyond the Apennine in the north, with Emilia, the region of Emilia in the Po Valley, and these the trade of the maritime republics really pushed for the development of continental trade, as we have seen, so that in the same Italy, other cities that were not on the sea had an equally important trade importance in many ways. There are many examples. We can see Asti, for instance, that is an Italian city in Piedmont, that is just above Genoa, roughly, northwest of Genoa, beyond the Apennine. And this is a city that really had a great importance because it was quite close to Genoa. So just across the mountains you had this city. So the Genoese exporting into France, for instance, would pass through Asti. And not surprisingly, Asti was located on the road towards France. That was obviously one of the most important trade routes of the time because it connected France with Rome. So it's an extremely important road since the early Middle Ages, at least, if not before. But there are other centers like Piacenza, for instance, in Emilia, that had a huge importance, because I don't have a map now, but if you look at it, it's substantially between many. First of all, it's splendidly located on the rivers, and over important roads, including the same road for France and the ancient Roman Emilia road. So it's a sort of obligated passage point, and in fact Piacenza had a huge important, especially strategical importance, that was reflected also by her trade, from her wealth deriving from trade. And we obviously don't have to forget probably the most powerful center of Italy during this time, that is Milan. Milan is an all terrestrial entity, even even when she begins to expand at a certain point, she's able to subjugate Genoa as well, but she remains mainly a terrestrial power that is capable of extending her influence on most northern and central Italy at a point. And it's surrounded by a very fertile area in the Po Valley. And by the 13th century, she began to increase the investments in trade and in manufactures, especially exploiting her geographical location, since Milan is at the foot of the Alps. So it's just beyond, it's very close to, obviously, both to Germany and France. It's this huge center that has immediately even a very aggressive minded attitude towards the surrounding cities, and that's why she manages to rise at a certain point to such great power, because basically she invaded other cities that were entrusted to whose management was entrusted to Milanese merchants and bankers that financed in turn that kept feeding in turn the Milanese expansion. So a very interesting entity in this sense, and the Milanese exported really a lot of different goods. You could find fustians, for instance, iron. Milan and Brescia, that is a city not really close to Milan, but it's still in the northwestern part of Italy, were the only advanced metallurgical centers in Europe. I was saying before that Italy didn't have many metallurgical resources, but at this time, this gives you the dimension of Italian wealth. It was, for the technology of the time especially, the Italians of Milan and Brescia that were close to certain iron mines in the Alps were the ones who could invest into mineral extraction and into iron working, so that basically until the early modern age, basically the whole metallurgical industry of Europe was actually the Italian one. Obviously the other Europeans did produce iron, but the Italians of Milan and Brescia were the only ones who had to establish an industry, and even the whole armor and weaponry fashion and production was of Europe was very heavily influenced by Italy, which exported a lot of armors and weapons. So that and we can't keep track of that archaeologically speaking, because this Italian industry put marks on the its products. So we can easily notice how, even in areas that are richer in mineral resources like Germany, metallurgy and weapon and armor production was very backwards compared to Italy up to a very recent times. And most weapons and armor were actually bought by from the Italians at this time, from all over Europe. And the Milanese also obviously exported a big deal of goods, and in this sense all these goods passed from Genoa, because Genoa is also very close to Milan. She always had very strong ties to it, and we don't have to forget even the demand of the Italians, because the Italians also imported a lot of goods from all over Europe, like hats, woolen hats, and linen from Germany, very prized textiles from Flanders, wool from England, and from the British Islands in general, as well as skins and furs, copper, dean, silver, saddles, a lot of goods that obviously spread money in other European in the other European countries that produced such goods. So Italy was this huge engine that made European economy really developing very much, and we should never forget that, because I often talked already about the concepts that I came up with. I believe firstly of the giants complex. People looking at a political map of Europe of the low Middle Ages, and being immediately attracted by these big entities like England or France or Castile or the Byzantine Empire, and looking at Italy, you find this mass of many city-states. You don't even think they are important, but telling the truth, those were the most important cities of the world at the time. And the whole group of central northern Italy and even southern Italy, in lesser part, were definitely the most important entity that existed in Europe at the time, and the whole trade system of Europe had its fulcrum into Italy. And quantitatively speaking, if you study history of economics, you realize that without Italy, great part of the European expansion would have been hampered, essentially. So what the Italians did was definitely amazing in many ways, and shouldn't be forgotten. Also because it wasn't just an economical thing, but it triggered many other phenomena, like the humanism and Renaissance that we recalled at the beginning of the video, that without those economical resources would have not existed. And it's very important also because that prefigured and prepared for the modern age in many ways. In a largely agrarian world, like the European was at the time, you find that Italian society was very different also in other ways. It was a much more modern and secularized region. Socially speaking, the Italians were the first ones who began to dare to think at form institutional forms, be more pragmatic, to abandon earlier certain mindsets of the old world and bringing Europe into the new one. In many ways, there are certain areas of Europe that basically didn't know the levels of development of the Italian peninsula for centuries and centuries. So the whole Italian history is so during this period is so crucial to understand many processes that actually even took place later in time, and that really make you understand how important this chapter of medieval history really is. So I think I made my point. 40 minutes is enough. If you like this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further content. As always, I thank you very much for listening to me, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.